The morning light filtered through the glass walls of Forrester Creations with an elegance that belied the tension coiled within its corridors. The scent of fresh orchids filled the lobby, mingling with the sterile hum of ambition that had always defined this empire of silk and illusion. Eric Forrester stood before his old office door, the same one that once bore his name in gold letters, now replaced with ridges. The faint glimmer of that new plaque struck him like a blade polished too bright to be ignored. Retirement was supposed to have given him peace, a graceful bow from a stage he built with his own hands. Instead, it had left him with a taste of betrayal thick on his tongue and the echo of footsteps that no longer belonged to him. He had told himself to walk away with dignity. Yet something in the air had shifted, tiny inconsistencies that whispered of rot beneath the gloss. A few missing invoices. A string of unusual transfers buried deep in the accounting system. And then the name that appeared too often on internal memos, Carter Walton. A man Eric trusted. A man Ridge called family. It began with curiosity and ended with dread. Late one night, alone in the empty offices, Eric had followed the digital trail like a ghost retracing his own legacy. What he found made the blood drain from his face. Falsified valuations, inflated profit sheets, and a parallel structure designed to reroute ownership percentages in favor of Brooke Logan Forrester and her team. It was not only fraud, it was betrayal disguised as strategy. And the architects of that deception were his own son and the woman who had once been the love of his life. For hours, Eric sat in silence at his old desk, the evidence glowing on the computer screen, the shadows around him lengthening until the room felt like a confessional. Every keystroke he replayed was a wound reopening. How many times had he forgiven Ridge? How many times had he chosen love over accountability? But this was not just ambition. It was an erasure of everything he had built. They had stripped him not merely of his title, but of his dignity. The next morning, the company buzzed with anticipation for a board meeting that promised to redefine the future of Forrester Creations. Brooke arrived early, her reflection perfect in the mirrored elevators, her perfume sharp as confidence. She had worked for this moment, a restructuring that would place her team, the Logans, in key creative and managerial positions. Ridge would present the motion, Carter would handle the legal framework, and together they would crown themselves as the new era of Forrester Creations. But as she stepped into the conference room, she noticed the chair at the end of the table, the founder's chair, empty, untouched, yet radiating presence. Brooke brushed off the unease. Eric had retired. He wouldn't come. She told herself that over and over, even as the room filled with murmurs and the air thickened with a sense of unfinished business. Ridge entered next, carrying that familiar blend of arrogance and charm, nodding curtly at Carter, who sat stiffly with his folders aligned like armor. The two men exchanged a silent look, one part reassurance, one part conspiracy. They had rehearsed this moment, the language, the tone, the numbers that would impress the board and silence the skeptics. Ridge believed that once he unveiled their vision, even Eric would have to respect it. But destiny has a cruel taste for irony. As Ridge began to speak, the double doors swung open with a slow, deliberate creak. Every head turned. The room fell silent, as if time itself had stopped to watch. Eric Forrester stood in the doorway, dressed immaculately in charcoal gray, his silver hair gleaming under the recessed lights. There was no warmth in his smile, only the composure of a man who had already buried something sacred. "Don't stop on my account," he said quietly, stepping forward. The voice was calm, but beneath its steadiness was a tremor that only those who loved him could recognize, a tremor born not of weakness, but of wrath controlled too long. Ridge froze mid-sentence. "Dad," I thought, but Eric didn't let him finish. He placed a thick envelope on the table and with one sharp movement, scattered its contents, sheets of printed data, financial records, internal memos, across the polished surface. They slid like shards of glass toward Brooke and Ridge, rustling like accusation itself. The room went utterly still. "These," Eric said, his voice cutting through the air, "are the lies you built your empire on." Carter's face blanched as his name appeared on the signatures. Brooke reached instinctively for the papers, scanning the numbers that, only hours before, had seemed flawless. Her heart stuttered. The structure they created to secure power was not supposed to see daylight, especially not from Eric's hands. Ridge tried to recover, to summon that effortless authority that had once made boardrooms bend to his will. There must be a misunderstanding, he began, but the words sounded small, foreign, even to him. Eric's eyes locked on his son. A misunderstanding? His voice cracked, each syllable like a blow. You falsified valuations. You redirected assets. You took my company, our family's legacy, and turned it into a playground for manipulation. He turned to Brooke then, and for the first time in years, she could not meet his gaze. The woman who once could disarm any man with a smile now looked like a stranger caught in her own reflection. And you, Eric continued, after everything, after all the chances I gave you, all the bridges I rebuilt, you stood by and let it happen. Or worse, you helped design it. The hum of the city outside faded. The only sound was the faint rustle of papers as Carter pushed them back together, his hands trembling. The board members exchanged glances, uncomfortable witnesses to a family imploding. Ridge rose, trying to regain control. We did what we had to do to keep Forrester Creations relevant. You were slowing down, Dad. The investors needed confidence. This was a restructure, not a betrayal. But Eric's expression hardened into something that could not be reasoned with. You didn't just restructure a company, he said quietly. You restructured your own conscience. Every word landed with precision. Years of fatherly affection turned into measured condemnation. Brooke reached out, perhaps to plead, perhaps to soften the blow, but Eric's look stopped her mid-gesture. You traded integrity for influence, he said, and now you expect me to applaud? Carter tried to interject, his voice faltering. Mr. Forrester, there were legal justifications. Eric's fist slammed onto the table, silencing him. Don't insult me with legalities. You forged documents under my name. You manipulated projections. You used my legacy to validate your deceit. The only justification you have is greed. Silence returned, deeper now, charged with humiliation and disbelief. Ridge's face flushed with a mix of anger and fear. For a moment, the mighty designer who had conquered Paris and Milan looked like a boy again, caught, cornered, defenseless before the one man whose approval had always mattered most. Dad, he said finally, his voice breaking, you don't understand what it's like to live in your shadow. Every design, every decision, I'm compared to you. Maybe I crossed a line, but it was the only way to build something that was mine. Eric's shoulders sagged, but his voice remained steady. You think legacy is ownership? That's your mistake. Legacy is stewardship. You were meant to protect what we built, not rewrite it to feed your ego. Brooke's lips parted, trembling. Eric, please. I didn't want to hurt you. Ridge said it was the only way to keep control from the outsiders, to make sure Forrester stayed a family business. Eric turned toward her slowly. A family business? He gestured around the room. Do you see a family here? All I see are signatures and lies. The atmosphere fractured. What had begun as a corporate meeting now resembled a courtroom. The witnesses, board members, assistants, even the janitor peeking from the doorway, knew they were watching history unravel. Eric's next move was devastating in its precision. He pulled out a single page, an official letter of revocation. Effective immediately, he declared, I am reclaiming executive authority under the Founders Clause. Ridge Forrester and Carter Walton are hereby suspended pending a full investigation. Gasps erupted. Ridge's jaw tightened. Brooke tried to protest, but Eric's authority cut through the room like thunder. The empire he had created was his again, not out of pride, but necessity. For a long moment no one moved. Then Ridge spoke, voice low and trembling. You can't just erase me, Dad. You can't erase what I've done. Eric looked at him with an exhaustion that felt older than his years. I don't need to erase you, he said softly. You've done that yourself. When he turned and walked out, The room remained frozen. Brooke sank into her chair, her hands shaking as she stared at the contracts that had once promised her everything. Ridge stood motionless, eyes fixed on the door his father had just closed. He felt the weight of his ambition collapse upon him, realizing that every victory he had claimed now looked like theft under the light of truth. In the quiet aftermath, Carter exhaled a broken sigh. "He knows everything," he whispered. Ridge didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. Across the hall, Eric entered his old office, the one Ridge had claimed as his own. He ran his hand across the desk, the grain of the wood smooth beneath his palm. It was not triumph he felt, but sorrow. Power regained meant innocence lost. His heart ached not for the company, but for the son he could no longer recognize. Outside, Los Angeles glittered beneath the setting sun, indifferent to human disgrace. The city had seen empires rise and fall before. But within the glass walls of Forrester Creations, something sacred had fractured beyond repair. As the day faded, Ridge remained seated in the boardroom, surrounded by the debris of his undoing. Brooke approached him quietly, her eyes red from unshed tears. She wanted to comfort him, to remind him that they still had each other, but even that felt hollow. Their alliance had been built on strategy, not love. Now that the strategy had collapsed, all that remained was silence. Somewhere deep inside the building, Eric watched them from the shadows. For a fleeting second, he almost wished he hadn't found the documents. But then he remembered what it felt like to build Forrester Creations from nothing, how every thread, every stitch, carried his name and his values. To allow deceit to rewrite that history would be a greater sin than breaking a family apart. And so the founder, once a father, became a sentinel once more, guarding not just a fashion house, but the soul of what it meant to be a Forrester. Outside, the city lights flickered like the glittering sequins of a gown, beautiful, deceptive, and fleeting. Somewhere between love and betrayal, ambition and redemption, the story of Forrester Creations turned another page, written in ink that would never wash out. The wedding, the regrets, and the reckoning the morning that dawned over Los Angeles carried a sense of ceremony and foreboding. The sun rose on the Forrester estate in golden shards that seemed almost too bright, as if the world itself knew it was about to witness something delicate, the rebirth of a dream that had already died once. Hope Logan stood before her mirror, her fingers trembling over the lace that traced her wedding gown, and for a moment the reflection staring back at her looked less like a bride and more like a survivor. Around her, voices hummed in gentle chaos, Brooke bustling with ribbons, the children giggling, the scent of white roses flooding the room. It should have been pure happiness. Yet beneath that polished calm lay the haunting memory of every ceremony she had walked through before, every promise that had unraveled. Liam Spencer waited downstairs, composed but uncertain. Their history stretched between them like a corridor of mirrors, one reflecting forgiveness, another betrayal, another hope renewed too many times. Today was meant to draw a line through that repetition, to prove that love could outlast human frailty. The minister preparing to unite them was none other than Deacon Sharp, Hope's father, a man who once would have been barred from even standing at her side. His presence marked a quiet revolution in her life. The father who had hurt, abandoned, and finally atoned was now leading her toward the altar. For Deacon, this was not just a role, it was redemption clothed in ritual. Across the city, however, a storm gathered in the sterile corridors of a hospital. Taylor Hayes sat behind her desk, eyes fixed on a file she could not read because the woman pacing before her had turned the air electric with resentment. Sheila Carter Sharp, the name alone was enough to make anyone in Los Angeles flinch, had come to remind the world that she would not be erased. She spoke of injustice, of being excluded from her own son's wedding. Her voice rose and cracked, each word more venomous than the last, until the very walls seemed to shrink away from her. Taylor, ever the professional, tried to hold her ground, but there was fear hiding in the corners of her calm expression. Sheila's anger was not the petty outrage of a jealous woman. It was the howl of someone who had spent her life clawing at the edges of acceptance. She had reinvented herself 100 times, wrapped her crimes in the language of remorse, and yet forgiveness remained a locked door. To her, the news that Hope's wedding was happening without her was proof that redemption was a lie designed for others. Taylor called her unstable, a single word, but one that detonated between them like glass shattering. The insult was more than professional judgment. It was the resurrection of every label that had ever caged Sheila's humanity. Her eyes glowed with that familiar madness, the one that could turn a promise into a threat without changing tone. Taylor tried to retreat into logic, insisting that boundaries had to exist, that she could not be both therapist and friend, especially while treating Deacon. Yet her voice faltered when Sheila asked why friendship with Deacon was permissible, but friendship with her was not. The hypocrisy hung heavy. Taylor's silence revealed her conflict. She was not afraid of Sheila alone, but of what her own compassion might unleash. Beneath her composed demeanor, Taylor carried guilt, the quiet knowledge that she had once stood too close to the abyss herself. At the Forrester mansion, meanwhile, Ridge Forrester lingered in a different kind of silence. The grand designer who had shaped so many love stories in silk and satin now found himself standing in the shadow of his own father's disappointment. Eric Forrester had been the architect of their empire, yet time had rendered him frail. Their last conversation had been laced with pride and pain, Ridge insisting that Eric rest, Eric hearing only betrayal. As Hope's wedding unfolded without them, Ridge felt the weight of absence like a physical ache. He imagined his father alone, surrounded by sketches that would never be realized, and wondered whether ambition had turned him into the very man he once swore never to become. The scene at the chapel began with music, the same familiar melody that had scored so many Forrester ceremonies, but today it carried a melancholy undertone. Guests rose. Brooke Logan's eyes gleamed with unshed tears as she watched her daughter step into the light. Hope moved as if in slow motion, her dress whispering across the floor, her heartbeat louder than the organ behind her. Each step was a vow that this time she would not run, that this time the world would not crumble before the ink on their marriage certificate dried. In the front row sat Bill Spencer, the tycoon whose life had intersected with theirs in countless ways: rival, father-in-law, manipulator, savior. He clapped a hand over his chest, as if studying a heart too proud to admit it cared. Brooke caught his gaze briefly, a silent acknowledgement of shared history and weary gratitude. Whatever their entanglements, today was about forgiveness, about families daring to believe in renewal. Deacon began the ceremony with a voice steadier than he expected. He spoke not as a man haunted by his past, but as a father humbled by grace. His words, about love enduring through darkness, about the courage to begin again, felt almost personal confessions. Hope listened, her eyes flickering between him and Liam, sensing that the real audience was not the congregation but the ghosts gathered around them. When Deacon reached the moment to ask if anyone objected, the room seemed to inhale collectively. And somewhere miles away, in the hospital corridor still echoing with rage, Sheila Carter stopped pacing. A thought coiled in her mind. If they would not invite her into the light, she would force the world to see her in the dark. Her fury condensed into resolve. The notion of Hope's perfect wedding unfolding while she, the mother of the groom's father, was kept out, it was intolerable. Her lips curved into a smile that did not reach her eyes. Taylor watched that transformation and knew the danger had not passed, it had only changed shape. She wanted to warn someone, but pride and fear kept her silent. Back at the wedding, rings glinted like captured stars. Hope's hand trembled as Liam slipped the band onto her finger, a circle without beginning or end, symbolic of the forgiveness she had fought for. Outside, the December air shifted. A cloud crossed the sun. In the uneasy hush, a memory flashed through Liam's mind. The last time they stood at an altar, promising eternity. Could vows mend what history had fractured? His uncertainty vanished when Hope smiled, her expression radiating something pure, defiant, almost holy. Yet in every soap opera paradise, danger hides behind applause. As the guests rose to celebrate, a whisper spread through the crowd. Something about a car seen near the gates, a figure refusing to identify herself. Deacon stiffened. The minister's composure wavered, and for an instant, father and daughter shared the same thought. Sheila. The name was never spoken, but it charged the air. Meanwhile, Ridge finally reached his father's home, determined to end their estrangement. Eric, surrounded by sketches of gowns he would never sew, greeted him with silence. Ridge began to speak, haltingly at first, admitting that every design he had ever drawn, was a reflection of Eric's teaching. He confessed his arrogance, his fear of watching the man he admired fade. The words came too late to erase the hurt, but perhaps soon enough to begin healing it. Eric listened, his eyes softening. In that quiet reconciliation, the Forrester legacy, one of art, ambition, and endless love, flickered back to life. Back at the wedding, the tension mounted like a held breath. Brooke stepped forward to give her blessing, her voice trembling with emotion. Bill followed, offering a rare moment of sincerity. For a heartbeat, it seemed that peace had finally settled over them all. But destiny in Los Angeles is rarely content with stillness. At the hospital, Taylor received a call, a warning from the catering service about a disturbance near the venue. Her pulse quickened. She knew instinctively who was responsible. Torn between duty and fear, she rushed to her car, every red light stretching the distance between salvation and disaster. In her mind, she rehearsed words that might calm Sheila, yet deep down she understood that logic was useless against obsession. As Hope and Liam exchanged vows, the camera of fate shifted again to Sheila, standing outside the chapel's iron gate. The wind tangled her hair, and her eyes shimmered with something beyond anger, a wounded longing for the family she could never truly join. She imagined bursting through those doors, declaring her right to be there, to be seen, to be forgiven. But a fragment of sanity whispered that such an act would destroy Deacon's fragile peace and the respect she had barely begun to earn. The struggle within her was nearly Shakespearean, the monster fighting the mother, vengeance warring with the desire for love. Inside, Deacon's words concluded the ceremony. Hope and Liam were pronounced husband and wife once again. Applause erupted, music soared, and for a moment, happiness felt tangible. The couple kissed, a symbol, a truce, a new beginning. Yet even as confetti drifted like snow, a faint unease rippled through Deacon's chest. He turned toward the window, glimpsing movement beyond the garden. Just the wind, he told himself. Perhaps it was. Or perhaps destiny had simply chosen its next scene. Later that evening, after the guests had dispersed and laughter had faded into candlelight, Ridge joined the reception. He congratulated the couple, embraced Brooke, and even allowed himself to dance once, awkwardly but genuinely. When he caught sight of Deacon, there was no hostility, only the quiet acknowledgement of two men who had each failed and redeemed themselves in different ways. The day that began with estrangement ended with a fragile web of connections knitting itself back together. But miles away, in a small, dim apartment, Sheila poured herself a drink and stared at her reflection in the glass. The anger had drained, leaving only exhaustion. She replayed Taylor's words, "We can't be friends." They echoed like a curse. She wondered if redemption was ever truly possible for someone like her, or if every attempt to change was doomed to collapse under the weight of the past. For the first time in years, tears slid down her face, unbidden. She whispered to the empty room that she had only wanted to belong. Then, as always, the softness vanished, replaced by cold determination. She picked up her phone and began to dial. The next act, whatever it would be, had already begun. And so the episode closed not on the wedding's bliss, but on its shadow. Ridge's reconciliation with Eric hinted at healing but also mortality. Hope's vows promised renewal, yet carried the ghost of repetition. Taylor's fear foreshadowed danger still to come, and Sheila, the eternal outsider, reminded everyone that peace in this world is only ever temporary. As the camera panned across the quiet chapel, the scattered petals on the floor seemed to form a question rather than a blessing. How long can happiness survive in a city built on secrets? The answer, as every Forester knows, depends not on love alone but on the choices made in the fragile hours after the music ends.